On a cold morning in September 1486, a thin veil of mist clung to the cobblestones of Winchester, England, carrying the earthy scent of turned soil and the crisp bite of autumn. The country was exhausted from decades of fighting known as the Wars of the Roses. Families had been torn apart and kings had been killed in battle. But now a new king named Henry VII was on the throne. He needed something more than just a crown to prove he should be there. He needed a miracle. When his wife Elizabeth of York gave birth to a healthy baby boy, the people of England didn't just see a prince, they saw a king. They saw the return of a legend, and they saw a boy named Arthur, named after the famous King Arthur of the Round Table, who was born in the very city many believed was the site of Camelot. This was the once and future king, come back to life to unite a broken land. But history complicates this promise. While his younger brother, Henry VIII, is well remembered, Arthur has largely faded into obscurity, a ghostly figure overshadowed by the drama that followed his death. Yet the influence of Arthur's short life reverberates through history, as his early death set off a chain of events that challenged the very foundation of an empire. Arthur was supposed to fulfill the legend, but died at 15, leaving behind a question that shaped England's fate. Could his early death destabilise everything his birth was meant to secure? If you think this is just a story about a sick boy who died young, you're missing the main point. Arthur Tudor's brief marriage and the rumours around it became the pivotal event that would challenge England's religious and political identity. Picture Arthur lifting a cup of ale on the morning of November the 15th, 1501, after his public union with Catherine of Aragon. That moment, brimming with youthful bravado, foreshadows a seismic shift, an empire torn asunder over a single unguarded boast. In that moment, Arthur's consummation made personal actions political consequences. At the time, this was just a teenage boy bragging to his friends, but 30 years later, these exact words would be used as evidence in a court case that decided whether England would stay Catholic or become Protestant. Ambassadorial reports from the Spanish court are said to have noted the incident, hinting that the marriage may have indeed been consummated. If Arthur was telling the truth, then Catherine was not a virgin, and she later married his brother, Henry VIII. If she wasn't a virgin, then according to the laws of the time, her marriage to Henry was a sin. This single question, did they or didn't they, led to the execution of queens, the destruction of ancient monasteries, and a change in religion for millions of people. As we examine Arthur Tudor's life, we must confront the central question of this story, and the fate of an empire hinge on the events in a single bedroom. Arthur's life and death set in motion consequences no one expected, challenging whether a carefully constructed legend could withstand unpredictable reality. The birth of Arthur Tudor was not an accident, it was a carefully planned piece of political theatre. King Henry VII was a very smart and very nervous man. He had won the throne by defeating Richard III at the Battle of Bosworth Field in 1485, but he knew his claim to the throne was fraught with uncertainty. As a member of the House of Lancaster, he was under constant threat from rival claimants like the de la Pole family, who enjoyed significant support among Yorkist sympathisers. By marrying Elizabeth of York, he sought to unite the two warring families. Yet Arthur became the living symbol of that union and the physical proof that the war was over. He carried the blood of both sides in his veins, making his birth an essential political strategy to solidify Henry's fragile claim. Henry VII moved his entire court to Winchester just for the birth. He wanted Arthur to be born in a place that felt magical and ancient. He had historians trace his family tree back to the old British kings, trying to prove that the Tudors were the rightful heirs to the land. When Arthur arrived on September the 19th or the 20th in 1486, he was a month early. Even though he was premature, his birth was celebrated with massive bonfires and street singing. Arthur was immediately given the title Duke of Cornwall, and by the time he was 3, he was a Knight of the Garter and the Prince of Wales. His parents were so convinced that God favoured their family that they gambled everything on this first child being a healthy boy. They didn't even have a plan B for his younger brother Henry, because they were so sure Arthur would live to be a great king. Arthur's childhood was very different from his father's. King Henry VII had grown up in hiding and exile, always worried about being captured or killed. Arthur, on the other hand, was raised in a world of safety and luxury. He was sent away from the palace in London to live in his own household at Farnham and later at Ludlow. This was done to keep him safe from the many diseases like the plague that were common in a big city. But Arthur was given the best education money could buy. He was a student of the new learning, which we now call humanism. His teachers included John Reed and the blind poet Bernard Andre. They taught him to read and write in Latin, the language of kings and scholars across Europe. And by the time he was a teenager, Arthur had studied the classics, leadership, and social skills. Contrary to some accounts that portray him as a weak, sickly child, contemporary reports describe Arthur as tall for his age and quite handsome. He had red hair and small eyes, and he looked a lot like his younger brother, Henry VIII. He was seen as a paragon of kingship, the perfect example of what a king should be: brave, smart, and fair. While Arthur was still learning his alphabet, his father was already negotiating his marriage. In the 1400s, kings didn't marry for love, they married to strengthen their countries. Henry VII wanted an alliance with Spain, which was becoming one of the most powerful nations in the world under King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella. In 1489, when Arthur was only 2 years old, the Treaty of Medina del Campo was signed. This was a very important agreement that did 3 main things. Both England and Spain agreed to help each other if they went to war with France. They also agreed to lower taxes on goods, which helped merchants in both countries become wealthy. And finally, Arthur would marry the Spanish princess Catherine of Aragon as soon as they were old enough. Catherine's dowry was set at 200,000 crowns, which would be worth millions of pounds today. However, the Spanish monarchs were very careful. They wouldn't send their daughter to England until they were sure Henry VII wouldn't be overthrown. They waited until Henry had executed all the people who claimed to be the real king, showing that the Tudor family was finally safe. While they waited to meet, Arthur and Catherine wrote letters to each other in Latin. These weren't exactly love letters as we see in movies today. They were formal and polite, and were probably written with their teacher's help. An excerpt from one of Arthur's letters hints at this formality, mixed with youthful curiosity. Dearest Catherine, though we are strangers of distance, let our words bridge the lands between us. In 1499, they were even married by proxy, which means they had a legal wedding ceremony even though they were in different countries. Arthur told the Spanish ambassador that he much rejoiced and to be married because of his deep and sincere love for a princess he hadn't even met yet. To prove to the world that the Tudors were great, Henry VII used every opportunity to put on a show. When Arthur was 12, he made a royal entry into the city of Coventry. This was a massive parade, with the whole city coming out to see the future king. While there, the city put on special days called pageants. Arthur was greeted by actors portraying the 9 worthies, the 9 greatest heroes of history, including Alexander the Great and Julius Caesar. At the end of the show, an actor playing King Arthur himself stepped forward to welcome the young prince. This was a powerful message to the people, proclaiming, "Your new prince is just as great as the heroes of the past." Catherine of Aragon finally arrived in England in October 1501. She had travelled for months and endured terrible storms at sea. When she and Arthur finally met for the first time at Dogmersfield, they had a funny problem. They both knew Latin, but they pronounced it differently, so they couldn't understand each other. They had to write things down or use translators to communicate. The wedding, though, took place on November the 14th, 1501, at St Paul's Cathedral in London. It was a massive event. A huge wooden stage was built inside the cathedral so that the thousands of people who crowded inside could see the royal couple. Both Arthur and Catherine wore white satin. Catherine's dress was Spanish in style with many pleats and a veil covered in gems and gold thread. He was escorted to the altar by Arthur's 10-year-old brother, Prince Henry, who walked beside her as the music of singers and trumpets filled the air. After the wedding, there were banquets, dancing, and jousting that lasted for 2 weeks. Wine even flowed from the public fountains for the people of London to drink. It was a moment of pure triumph for the Tudor family. The night of the wedding, a very important ritual took place, the bedding ceremony. In the 1500s, this wasn't private. The whole court accompanied the couple to their room. The bed was sprinkled with holy water, and a priest prayed that they have many children. The next morning, Arthur's friend said he came out of the room looking very happy. He reportedly said to his servant, "Willoughby, bring me a cup of ale, for I have been this night in the midst of Spain," a boast soon to echo in courtrooms. He also said that having a wife was a good pastime. Everyone at the time assumed that Arthur and Catherine had consummated their marriage, which of course meant they must have had sex. However, decades later, when Henry VIII wanted to divorce Catherine, she swore on her soul that she and Arthur had never actually had sex. She said they only slept in the same bed 7 times, and that Arthur was too sickly or weak to do anything. This is where history becomes uncertain. We have 2 very different stories. The English version, which is Arthur's friends remembered him bragging and looking healthy, and the Spanish version, Catherine's ladies-in-waiting said she looked sad and that Arthur was a delicate lad who couldn't fulfill his duties. So why does this matter? Well, because if the marriage was never finished, then Catherine was technically never Arthur's real wife. If she never was his real wife, then why was she allowed to marry Henry VIII? But if they did have sex, then Henry was committing a sin by marrying her. This debate led to the creation of the Church of England and the separation from the Pope in Rome. Shortly after the wedding, Arthur and Catherine were sent to Ludlow Castle on the border of Wales. This was where Arthur was supposed to run his own small government and learn how to be a king. But in late March 1502, a mysterious illness swept through the castle. It was described as a malign vapour in the air, and both Arthur and Catherine felt very sick. Catherine was strong enough to survive, but Arthur grew weaker every day. And on April 2nd, 1502, just 6 months after his wedding, the Prince of Wales died. The actual cause of his death is still a mystery. Modern scientists have several ideas. The sweating sickness was a scary disease that could kill a healthy person in just a few hours. Also, tuberculosis. Some historians believe Arthur had been coughing and weak for a long time. And the third one was antivirus. Some believe it was a disease spread by mice in the castle's dirty conditions. Arthur's death, though, was a total shock to everyone. His father, King Henry VII, and his mother, Elizabeth of York, were so upset that they both broke down in tears and had to comfort each other. Arthur's funeral was one of the saddest events in Tudor history. Because it was raining so hard, the journey from Ludlow to Worcester was a nightmare. The roads were filled with thick mud, and it took days to move the prince's body, just 33 miles. Following an old tradition, Arthur's heart was removed and buried in the church at Ludlow, near where he died. His body was then taken to Worcester Cathedral. The funeral had a very special ending. Arthur's personal servants and guards gathered around his grave. They took their wooden staffs, symbols of their power, and broke them over their heads before throwing them into the grave. This was a ritual that marked the end of their service to the prince. When Arthur died, he left Catherine of Aragon in a terrible situation. She was a widow in a foreign land, and nobody knew what to do with her. For the next 7 years, Catherine was stuck in England. Her father-in-law, Henry VII, didn't want to send her home because he would have to return her dowry. She wrote letters to her father in Spain saying she was so poor she couldn't even pay for food or clothes for her servants. Finally, after Henry VII died in 1509, his son Henry VIII decided to marry her. He said he did it because it was his father's dying wish, but he also likely found Catherine very brave and beautiful. It is impossible to overstate how much the world changed because Arthur Tudor died at age 15. If he had lived, the history books would have looked completely different. Arthur was described as amiable and gentle. He was a scholar who loved books and peace. His brother Henry VIII, on the other hand, was energetic, athletic, and often very angry. Because Arthur died, the throne went to a man who was much more impulsive and willing to break the rules to get what he wanted. The biggest change was the Reformation. Because Henry VIII wanted to marry Anne Boleyn and leave Catherine of Aragon, he had to break away from the Catholic Church. This break led to the Church of England, which was created, with the king as its head rather than the Pope. Monasteries were destroyed and old traditions were banned. And also, without the divorce from Catherine, Henry VIII might never have married Anne Boleyn, which means Queen Elizabeth I, one of England's greatest rulers, would never have been born. Arthur Tudor was the once and future king who never got to wear the crown, but in his short life he set off a chain reaction that shaped the world we live in today. He's the prince whose story is hidden in the shadows, but whose life was the foundation for everything that came after him.